Hello, it's Jimmy, and today I'm going to be talking about a book called Wilding by Isabella Tree. And Isabella Tree and her husband inherited quite a large bit of land from her husband's grandparents, which had been in the family for centuries, I think. They're sort of an old aristocratic family, and this was their kind of aristocratic estate. And since the Second World War, it had been used for intensive farming. And when they inherited it, I think in the late 80s, they tried to run it as a farm, tried to modernize a bit and make it profitable, make it work as a farm. But it wasn't really working. Financially, it didn't really make sense. Agriculturally, it didn't really make sense with the type of soil in the part of England that they're in. And they also weren't happy about the effects that their farming methods were having on some of the nature on the land. So in particular, they had these centuries old oak trees, and this oak expert came and spent a few days at the estate and was talking to them about them and pointing out some of the trees that he could tell were not well, and talking about how the farming methods had affected them. So this all changed their perspective on it, and they ultimately decided to stop farming that land and turn to a conservation method based on restoring the land, trying to restore it as far as possible to its pre-agricultural state. So that's a mode of conservation often known as rewilding. So the idea is roughly that you're trying to return the land to its wild state. And this book's called Wilding, I think partly because they discuss it a little bit, that the project is not fully rewilding. You don't just take your hands off the land, don't make any human interventions at all, and just let it run its course. Because that doesn't really work. For one thing, the land is not in... It's already full of chemicals and things like that. It's already been planted with certain agricultural seeds or grasses that can survive the kinds of chemicals that have been used in the land. So if you did just take your hands off and leave it, it would take centuries and centuries for it to get to that kind of state. The other thing is that when it was in its truly wild environment, there were all sorts of animals there, many of which are just extinct now. Large herbivores and large carnivores that would have roamed Britain a few thousand years ago just aren't here now. And just taking your hands off and leaving the land doesn't bring them back. And the interaction between the plant life and all other forms of life, including bacteria, fungi, but also and especially animals, is a really important part of that original kind of wild natural ecosystem. So taking it back to that wild state is not as straightforward as just doing nothing to it. But rewilding, it's not that simple. That's why there's a whole book about this particular rewilding project. But it's a much lower intensity form of conservation than a lot of others. So you try to introduce plants and animals that will create a kind of as close as you can get as a replica to that wild ecosystem, you let the animals do a lot of the tending to the plants that in other conservation projects volunteers do or hired staff do. So a lot of conservation is very expensive and labor intensive, and this is a cheaper, more natural way of doing it. And by introducing these animals and letting the natural processes guide your conservation, we don't understand how the natural world works perfectly. So you get kind of unpredicted outcomes as well as a result of this. And she talks about that, how they made certain decisions for certain reasons. They introduced certain animals and whatnot, and they had the effects that they were hoping for and expecting, but they also had all sorts of effects that they didn't know to expect. So that was really interesting. Another thing that they talked a lot about in the book was the science behind what they were doing. So a lot of what they were doing, it was trying to be driven by science, even though the scientific knowledge is incomplete. And there's certain controversial ideas in the science of it as well. In particular, ideas around what did the natural world really look like before major human intervention turned it into what we have now. So some people, kind of the scientific consensus is this theory called the closed canopy theory, that Britain and Western Europe and a lot of parts of the world would just have been completely covered in every bit of land pretty much by densely populated trees. So pretty much anywhere you would walk on the land, you'd be under the shade of some tree. Just like the whole island was one big forest type thing. But other scientists don't think that was the case, and think that because of the animals and different things like that, there would have been patches of land that weren't covered by trees, and you would have had different kinds of ecosystems that are more like meadows and things like that. Anyway, so she talks about both of those scientific perspectives on the closed canopy theory and a load of other scientific issues in a very accessible way. So if you're interested in the science of these things, it's a good book, but it's also not out of your depth. If you're not that interested, you can kind of gloss through those parts and you'll still get a lot from the book. If you're interested in nature, sort of the interaction between nature and farming and people and nature and everything like that, and what was there, what animals and plants are not here because of the way we've been living in the past 100 or 200 years, and what can we bring back and what can't we bring back and how would we bring it back and things like that. So that's really interesting. It also talks a lot about the kind of bureaucratic policies that get in the way of their project. So you learn about that process as well, and sort of the government interventions that have helped and those that have made it more difficult. And you also learn about how some of the things, some of the other benefits, like with flooding prevention. So there is a species of European beavers that was native to Britain, but went extinct in the wild in Britain at some point. And one part that I really enjoyed in the book was where she talked about how bringing back beavers not only has a load of benefits in terms of restoring wildlife and giving beavers somewhere to live and stopping them from going extinct completely, but also can prevent flooding because of the way the beavers build all their dams and have a big impact on how rivers flow in a way that can be really effective to prevent flooding. And apparently it's a lot cheaper and more effective than a lot of the methods that we use now. And that was especially interesting to me because the part of northern England where I live, nearby, every few years there's really severe flooding that does a lot of damage, and not enough money is spent by the government preventing that and fixing it up. But if we just reintroduce beavers, that might make the burden of flood prevention a lot lower and the burden of being flooded a lot less as well. So that idea really stuck with me. But there's loads in there. If you're interested in, as I say, nature, farming, anything like that, I think it's well worth a read. So check it out, Wilding by Isabella Tree. And what an appropriate name for an author writing about nature. Tree, what a nice surname. And also, my cousin pointed out that her name is a question. Is a bell a tree? No, it's not. It's a bell, not a tree. Anyway, let me know if you've read it or if you are interested in picking it up, or any other nature books that you've read recently that you enjoyed. And I'll see you in the comments. Thank you.